Today, I'm going to tell you the story of a lonely rancher, a twice-widowed woman who found each other against all odds. Thomas Reid and Sarah Matthews faced a town's cruel judgment and a powerful enemy threatening everything they built. But what happened next left everyone in shock. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening to this story from. Parched Earth, Cottonwood Springs, Arizona Territory, 1883. The last drops of water seeped into the crack, disappearing before Thomas Reid's eye. He removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. The dusty 3 months without proper rain had turned the creek that gave his ranch its name into nothing than a memory, replacing it and turning toward 4 cattle had died this week alone. At this rate, he'd have nothing. The ride back to the ranch house was silent, save for the creak of leather and the occasional snort from his horse. The land around him, once lush with grass and cottonwood, now stretched barren and brown to the horizon. Only the Patterson property to the north still had water, fed by an underground spring that hadn't yet succumbed to the drought. As the ranch house came into view, Thomas noticed an unfamiliar wagon outside. Company was rare these days, especially with most folks in town avoiding him since Mary's passing 2 years ago. Grief made people uncomfortable, and Thomas had grief to spare. A woman stood on his porch, her back straight as a fence post, hands clasped before her. As Thomas drew closer, he recognized Sarah Matthews, or Sarah Coleman, as she'd been known before her second husband died last winter. "Mrs. Matthews," Thomas said, "what brings you out this way?" "Mr. Reid." Oh, she nodded politely, though her eyes betrayed wariness. "I've come about the position." Thomas frowned. Leading his horse to the water trough, the animal looked disappointed at the meager inch remaining. "What position would that be?" "Housekeeper. Your advertisement in the Mercantile." She produced a folded paper from her pocket. "You're seeking household help, are you not?" Thomas took the paper, recognizing his own hasty scrawl. He'd written it months ago, before the drought had tightened its grip, before the notion of paying someone had become an impossible luxury. "That's an old notice," handing it. "I'm not in a position to hire anyone just now." Sarah's composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of desperation quickly masked by dignity. "I see." Something in her expression stopped Thomas from turning away. The proud tilt of her chin couldn't hide the shadows beneath her eyes, or the way her dress hung loose at her waist. Town gossip said she'd been struggling since Daniel Coleman's passing, with 2 dead husbands in 5 years, making her the subject of whispers and speculation. "It's not proper anyway," Thomas heard himself say. "A single woman living out here with a man alone." A hint of fire sparked in. "Proper doesn't fill an empty stomach, miss. And I believe my reputation is already beyond salvaging, according to Cottonwood Springs." Her blunt. Most women he knew would sooner starve than acknowledge such truths aloud. "The house is a mess," the words coming before he'd fully decided to speak them. "I can't offer much wage, just room, board, and what little cash I can spare when the cattle sell. I'm not afraid of hard work, Sarah, and I don't require much." Thomas studied her, the delicate features that belied her straight-backed resilience, the golden brown hair neatly pinned despite the heat, the hands that showed signs of recent labor. She was younger than Mary had been, perhaps 28, his 34 years, and possessed a beauty that even hardship couldn't dim. "There's a small room off the kitchen," finally. "It's yours if you want it. We'll try for a month, see how it suits us both." Relief softened her features briefly. "When shall I begin?" "No time like the present if you've got your things." Thomas gestured to her wagon. "I'll help you unload." The interior of the house revealed the full extent of Thomas's bachelor. Unwashed dishes stacked haphazardly, dusty furniture, clothes draped over chairs. Sarah surveyed it without comment, though Thomas felt a flush of embarrassment he hadn't. Mary was always the one who kept things proper, the words emerging roughly. It was the first time he'd spoken his wife's name aloud in months. Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "My condolences." The whole territory heard how devoted you were during her illness. Thomas turned away, busying himself with bringing in Sarah's trunk. He didn't want her, or to see what lived in his eyes when Mary was mentioned. "I'll need to check the north pasture before dark," the subject. "The kitchen's yours to organize as you see fit. There's not much in the way of supplies, but what's there you're welcome to use." Sarah was already rolling up her sleeves, her attention turned to the task at hand. "I'll have something ready when you return." As Thomas headed back outside, the strangeness of the situation struck him. For 2 years he'd lived alone with his grief. The house is empty and neglected. Now a woman, a twice-widowed woman with a reputation almost as damaged as his own, would be sleeping under his roof, cooking in Mary's kitchen. He wasn't sure how he felt about that, wasn't sure he could feel much of anything anymore. The north pasture looked worse than he'd feared. The cattle gathered listily in what little shade remained, ribs showing through dull hide. Thomas's foreman, Eli, approached on horseback, his weathered face grim. "Patterson's men were sniffing around the property line again," Eli reported. "Reckon old William's getting ideas about your water rights." "What water, Thomas? Creek's bone dry. He knows what's underneath." Eli spat tobacco juice into the parched earth. "Underground springs don't vanish. They just go deeper. Man who owns this land when the drought breaks will have himself a fortune." Thomas frowned. William Patterson had been trying to buy him out since Mary died. The offers had grown increasingly generous as Thomas's situation deteriorated. Still, this land was all he had left of the dream they'd built together. Selling felt like a final betrayal. "We'll manage," Thomas said, more to himself than to Eli. "Saw a wagon at the house," Eli remarked casually. "The Matthews woman taking the housekeeper position?" News traveled fast, even in open country. For a trial period, Eli raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He didn't need to. Thomas could read the unspoken warning. "People, she needs the work, and I need the help. Not my business who you hire," Eli's expression. "Just mind that a woman with her history brings conflict." "Her history?" Eli. "2 dead husbands before 30 makes folks suspicious, especially with young Coleman dying so sudden-like. That's just gossip." "So," Eli shrugged. "But gossip can ruin a man as sure as drought." As Thomas rode back to the ranch house, the setting sun painted the barren lands in shades of gold and crimson. Ahead, smoke rose from his chimney, a sight so foreign it stopped him momentarily. Light glowed in the windows for just an instant. He could almost believe Mary would be waiting inside. The illusion shattered as Sarah opened the door, wiping her hands on an apron. The house behind her already looked different, cleaner, more orderly. The air carried the scent of fresh bread and coffee. "Supper's ready," said simply. Thomas dismounted slowly, an unexpected tightness in his chest. He hadn't realized how accustomed he'd grown to returning to emptiness. Whispers and warnings. Sarah Matthews woke before dawn, her body already attuned to the rhythms of the ranch after just 1 week. She dressed quickly in the small room off the kitchen, splashing water from the basin. The house was quiet, though she knew Thomas would already be outside, tending to the morning chore. The kitchen, her domain now, had been transformed from chaos to order. Shelves were organized, surface scrubbed clean, and the cracked stove polished to a dull shine. She took pride in these small victories, necessary distractions from the larger battles she couldn't win. As coffee began to percolate on the stove, Sarah kneaded dough for biscuits with practiced hand. Through the window, she could see Thomas at the corral, his tall figure outlined against the lightening sky. He moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to physical labor, though weariness showed in the set of his shoulders. In their week together, they had established a cautious routine. Thomas spoke little, answering her questions with the minimum words required. He ate her meals with quiet appreciation, but offered no conversation beyond ranch matters. At night, he retreated to his room with a bottle of whiskey that Sarah pretended not to notice. A man drowning his demons, she recognized. She had her own ghosts to contend with. The ranch bell rang suddenly, 3 short peals. Sarah frowned, setting aside the dough. Thomas had explained the signals. 3 rings meant visitors. Moving to the window, she saw dust rising on the road from town. A wagon approached, driven by a heavy-set man in a black suit. Beside him sat a woman in a bright blue dress, her rigid. Pastor Buchanan recognized, and Mrs. Whitley. Her stomach tightened. As head of the Ladies' Aid Society, Harriet Whitley wielded influence over Cottonwood Springs' social order. Her disapproval had followed Sarah like a shadow since Daniel's death. Thomas approached from the corral, wiping his hands on a rag. He glanced toward the house, his expression unreadable from this distance. Sarah smoothed her apron and hair, steeling herself for whatever was to come. The wagon stopped in the yard. Pastor Buchanan helped Mrs. Whitley down, her face pinched what appeared to be concern, but Sarah recognized as righteous indignation. "Mr. Reid," the pastor called, his voice carrying through the morning air. "Might we have a word?" Thomas nodded, gesturing toward the house. Sarah moved away from the window, returning to her biscuit. She shaped the dough with quick, sharp movement, listening to boots on the porch steps. Coffee's ready. When the door opened, not turning around. That would be lovely, sweet, poisoned honey. How domestic, Sarah. Pastor Buchanan, Mrs. This is an unexpected. Thomas followed them in, his jaw. Our visitors have concerns they wish to discuss. Indeed we do. Mrs. Whitley settled at the kitchen table without invitation. The Ladies' Aid Society has a responsibility to uphold moral standards in our community. Coffee, Pastor? Sarah offered, ignoring the implied criticism. Thank you, Mrs. Matthews. The pastor accepted the cup she poured, his expression uncomfortable. We've come out of genuine concern for both your situation. That's mighty considerate, but we're managing fine. Mrs. Whitley's lips thinned. A single man and woman living together outside the bonds of matrimony creates scandal. Surely you understand. Mrs. Matthews is my housekeeper. Nothing improper about it. Perhaps not in intention, but appearances matter. People talk. Let them, said sharply. Mrs. Whitley turned her attention to Sarah. My dear, after the unfortunate circumstances of your second husband's passing, your reputation is already fragile. This arrangement only fuels speculation. Sarah's hands tightened around the coffee pot. The woman's meaning was clear. Whispers about Daniel's sudden death hadn't faded. Some in town still suggested poison rather than fever had taken him, though the doctor had confirmed otherwise. I need work, Mrs. Whitley, Sarah said evenly. Mr. Reid needs help. It's a business arrangement. The Ladies' Aid could find you a position in town, Mrs. Whitley countered. Something more suitable, perhaps with the widow Jensen and her children. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Mrs. Matthews is employed here unless she wishes to leave. That's how it stays. Pastor Buchanan cleared his throat. William Patterson mentioned he's made offers to purchase your ranch. Perhaps now would be a good time to consider. Patterson put you up to this? Thomas straightened, eyes narrowing. He's concerned about the community, Mrs. Whitley, and he's willing to pay a fair price. With the drought worsening and your situation here causing talk, selling might be the sensible option. Sarah watched Thomas's face harden. My situation is none of Patterson's business, or yours. An uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Whitley sipped her coffee, eyeing Sarah. Tell me, Mrs. Matt, how are you finding ranch life? Different, Sarah read carefully, but rewarding. And your headaches? Have they improved? Mrs. Whitley's tone was solicitous, but her eyes were. Daniel mentioned before his passing how you suffered terribly. Required special powders from the apothecary, didn't you? Sarah felt heat. Mr. Coleman exaggerated my complaints. Did he? Mrs. Whitley smiled thinly. He seemed quite concerned about your delicate constitution. Thomas pushed away from the doorframe. I believe we've covered everything necessary. I've got cattle that need attention. Pastor Buchanan rose hastily. Of course. We didn't mean to intrude, only to offer guidance and to extend an invitation, Mrs. Whitley added, standing. The summer social is next Saturday. The community would welcome your attendance, Mr. Reid. You've been isolated too long since Mary's passing. At the mention of his wife, Thomas's expression closed completely. Good day, Pat. Mrs. Whitley? After they departed, silence hung heavy in the kitchen. Sarah busied herself with the biscuits, sliding them into the oven without looking at Thomas. They'll be back, she said with more concern. Thomas leaned against the counter, his presence large in the small kitchen. Patterson wants this. He'll use any leverage, including me. Sarah met his eyes directly. My reputation makes things difficult. Your reputation is your business, said, just like mine is mine. What they implied about Daniel's death isn't my Thomas cut her off. We all have pasts, Mrs. Matthews. I don't pry into yours. You don't pry into mine. Sarah nodded, grateful for his bluntness. Fair enough. Thomas hesitated, seeming to debate his next words. The social, they might be good for you to go. Show your face in town. Remind folks you're a respectable woman. And you? Sarah asked, surprised by his suggestion. Thomas shook his head. I haven't been social since Mary died. Don't intend to start now. Then neither will I, Sarah said firmly. My position is here, Mr. Reid, unless you're dismissing me. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or reluctant admiration. Suit yourself. Their visits won't stop. I've weathered worse storms than Harriet Whitley, Sarah, turning back to her story. Later, as she hung laundry in the yard, Sarah saw Thomas ride out with Eli toward the dried. The men's silhouettes wavered in the heat, mirages in a thirsty landscape. Beyond them, the Patterson property remained stubbornly green, protected by its hidden spring. Sarah understood now what was not just water for cattle, but Thomas's last connection to his wife. This land represented the life they'd built, the future they'd planned. Selling would be surrender, not just to Patterson, but to grief itself. As for her own position, she recognized the risk she posed to Thomas's standing. A widow with a clouded past brought complications, as Mrs. Whitley had made abundantly clear. The sensible choice would be to accept the offered position in town. But Sarah Matthews had learned that sensible choices rarely led to happiness, and despite everything, she felt something here she hadn't experienced in years, a fragile sense of it wouldn't last, of course, nothing ever did. But for now, this parched earth was home, broken fences. The summer heat intensified as July dragged on. 2 weeks after the pastor's visit, Thomas stood at the edge of his property, surveying a broken fence line. Cattle tracks led across the boundary toward Patterson's land, where water still flowed. Cut clean, Eli said, examining the severed wire. This wasn't no accident. Thomas said grimly. 6 head of cattle had wandered through overnight, now grazing on an excuse. I'll ride over, see if I can bring them back peaceful. Want company? Hand resting near his hole. No, best I go alone. Alone? The Patterson ranch house was a 2-story affair with a wide porch and glass windows, luxuries in this territory. As Thomas approached, a ranch hand ran inside, no doubt alerting his employer. William Patterson emerged moments later, a portly man with an expensive suit and meticulously groomed silver beard. His smile didn't reach his eye. Thomas Reid, what brings you to my doorstep? My cattle, Thomas Reid, remaining. My fence was cut on the boundary. 6 head wandered through. Surprise. Is that so? Well, trespassing cattle are rightfully claimed by the landowner. Arizona territorial law is quite clear. The fence was cut deliberately, keeping those cattle are mine. Serious accusation. Fading. Got proof my men did anything? Thomas met his gaze steadily. I'm not looking for trouble, Patterson. Just my cattle. Everything's for sale, Reid, Patterson said, stepping closer. Cattle, land, loyalty. He glanced pointedly at the Reid ranch in the distance. Even reputation. The threat was subtle. Leave Mrs. Matthews out of this. Interesting. Protective you become of a woman you barely know. She's quite beautiful, isn't she? Despite those rumors. My cattle. The older man sighed theatrically. Take them this time. But that creek bed of yours isn't getting any wetter, and my offer will. Neither will this drought, Thomas countered. Perhaps. But can you? Patterson smiled again. Think of what Mary would want. She was practical, sensible. The mention of his wife's name from Patterson's lips made Thomas's blood boil. Don't speak of her. My apologies, said, not sounding sorry at all. Just concerned for a neighbor. And for that lovely widow you've taken in. Town's not kind to women with questionable past. Thomas gathered his cattle in silence, herding them back toward his property. Patterson's words followed him like flies. At the fence line, he found Sarah waiting, rifle in hand. She looked different, hair loose around her shoulders, cheeks flushed from the sun. Eli told me what happened, she said, lowering the rifle as he approached. Did he give you trouble? Thomas shook his, surprised by nothing I couldn't handle. Together they guided the cattle through the broken fence. Sarah moved with unexpected confidence, anticipating the animal's movement. You've done this before. My father ran cattle in Texas where I was married. Another piece of her past revealed. Thomas found himself curious for more, despite his determination to maintain distance. We should mend this fence before dark. They worked side by side as the afternoon waned, Sarah handing him tools and holding wire taut while he secured it. The physical labor was familiar, but working alongside a woman, this woman was not. Patterson mentioned you, Thomas, said things about your past. Sarah's hands stilled momentarily. I imagine he did. Don't need to know detail, Thomas continued, focused. But if there's anything that might cause trouble for this ranch, I should hear it from you first. Sarah was quiet so long that Thomas thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was steady. My first husband, James, died in a mining accident. I mourned him proper, but married Daniel within a year. Town called it indecent haste. She paused. Daniel took sick suddenly. Fever. died within days. And people talked, Thomas finished. Sarah nodded. The doctor confirmed natural causes, but whispers spread. Said, I poisoned him for his store. Her eyes met his directly. I didn't, though he couldn't have said why. Something in her direct gaze, perhaps, or recognition of another soul, weighted by circumstance. My wife, he found himself saying, wasted away for months. Nothing I could do but watch. It was more than he'd spoken of Mary to anyone since her death. Sarah seemed to understand the significance, nodding without pressing. They finished the fence in comfortable silence. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the parched landscape in gold. Walking back to the house together, Thomas felt a strange sense of companionship he'd nearly forgotten. Patterson will try again, Sarah. The ranch house came into view. Men like him don't stop easily. No, they don't. Oh, and see, my presence complicates things for you, she added. Perhaps I should— You're staying, Thomas interrupted, the words emerging more forceful intended, if you want to. Sarah studied him, something unreadable in her expression. I want to. That evening, after dinner, Thomas didn't immediately retreat to his room as usual. Instead, he lingered at the table while Sarah cleared dishes. There's a creek that runs underground, he said abruptly, beneath this property. Mary and I chose this land because of it. Sarah turned, surprised by the information. Even with the drought, Thomas nodded. Goes deeper in dry times, but it's there. That's what Patterson wants. Not just grazing land, but the water rights. Can you access it? Dig a well? Been trying. No luck yet. He traced a pattern on the wooden table. Need to find exactly where it runs. Sarah leaned against the counter, considering. My father used a dowsing rod sometimes. Said he could feel the water calling. Thomas smiled faintly. Mary believed in that, too. Called it water witching. I could try, Sarah offered, if you'd allow it. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and something shifted between them. A fragile bridge forming over separate griefs. Tomorrow, Thomas said, rising. We'll try tomorrow. That night, the first time since Sarah's arrival, Thomas didn't reach for the whiskey bottle beside his bed. Instead, he lay awake, listening to the subtle sounds of another person moving in his home. Not Mary, never again Mary, but someone who, against all odds, beginning to matter. Water. Dawn broke with unusual cloud cover, a rare reprieve, relentless. Sarah stood in the yard, holding a forked willow branch. Thomas watched skeptically as she walked the property. The branch extended before her. My father swore by this method, she said, moving slowly across the parched earth. Said, water speaks to those willing to. Thomas remained doubtful, but followed in silence. They'd been at it for an hour, crossing the eastern section of his land without results. Mary believed in this, too. I always thought it was nonsense. Sarah glanced back at him. Yet here you are, running out of options. But there was no bite in his word. Near a stand of dying cottonwood, the branch suddenly dipped downward. Sarah's eyes widened. There. Feel it? Thomas took the branch, his hands covering hers. The wood seemed to pull downward with surprising force. Could be a coincidence. Excitement edged his voice. Try again, Sarah urged, stepping. Thomas walked in a small, returning to the same spot. Again the branch dipped. Told you, a genuine smile. That smile transformed her, made her look younger, unburdened by past that haunted her. He found himself wanting to see it again. Eli, he called to his foreman, who was mending a saddle nearby, bring shovels. We're digging here. The day passed in backbreaking labor. Thomas, Eli, and the ranch hand dug steadily, creating a wide pit that deepened as the hour. Sarah brought water and food, her presence a constant encouragement. 6 feet down, the soil darkened with moisture. Keep going, renewed energy in his movement. At 8 feet, water began to seep into the hole. By evening, they had reached 10 feet, and a steady pool formed at the bottom. We found it, wiping sweat from his brow. The underground creek. Thomas climbed out of the pit, exhaustion and triumph mingling in his expression. His eyes sought Sarah's. You did it, he said quietly. We did it, she corrected. That night they celebrated with a special dinner. Sarah had prepared a chicken, a luxury she'd been saving, and even Eli stayed to eat. The mood was lighter than the ranch had seen in months. We'll build a proper well tomorrow, Thomas said, as they finished the meal. Windmill after that, if we can get the parts. Patterson won't like it, Eli won't. Patterson can go to hell, Thomas replied, earning a rare laugh from Sarah. After Eli departed, Thomas and Sarah sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The usual barriers between them had softened, worn down by shared purpose and accomplishment. Thank you, Thomas, for believing when I couldn't. Sarah nodded, understanding he meant more than just the water. Sometimes it takes another person's faith to find what's been there all along. Thomas studied her profile in the fading light. Why did you really come here, Sarah? There must have been other positions, even with the rumors. She was quiet for considering her answer. I needed somewhere people didn't know me. Somewhere I could just be myself, not James's widow or Daniel's suspicious. And have you found that here? Her eyes met his. I'm beginning to. The moment stretched between them, fragile and dangerous. Thomas felt himself leaning slightly toward her, drawn by something he'd thought long buried with Mary. A flicker of light in the distance broke the spell. Thomas stood abruptly, squinting into the darkness. Fire, he said, alarm replacing whatever had been in his voice moments at the well site, Sarah hitching her skirts to keep pace. As they crested the small rise, the scene became clear. The wooden frame they'd erected around the well pit was ablaze, tools scattered around it. Get water, Thomas shouted, though they all knew the bitter irony. The nearest water was in the very pit being destroyed. Eli appeared from the bunkhouse, bringing blankets to beat at the flames. For 20 desperate minutes they fought the fire, finally subduing it to smoldering embers. The damage was severe. The wooden supports had collapsed inward, partially filling the pit they'd spent all day digging. Patterson! Eli spat, kicking at a charred board. Thomas said nothing, his face hard in the dying firelight. The momentary hope they'd all felt had been deliberately, cruelly extinguished. We'll start again tomorrow, Sarah said. Dig it out again. It'll take days, Eli. And who's to say they won't come back? Thomas turned to post guards tonight. Tomorrow, ride to town. Send a telegram to the territorial marshal about the fence cutting and this fire. Patterson has the law in his pocket. Try anyway, and bring back more ammunition. As Eli departed, Sarah placed a hand on Thomas's arm, quietly. Thomas covered her hand with his own, a gesture that surprised them both. No, it's just beginning. Later, as Sarah prepared for bed in her small room, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Thomas standing there, his expression troubled. Patterson won't stop at property damage, he said without preamble. When the marshal fails to help, he'll escalate. I'm not afraid, Sarah replied. You should be. Thomas's voice was low, intense. These men, they don't see boundaries. If they think hurting you would get to me. He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize what he'd revealed. Would it? Sarah asked. Get to you? Thomas really looked at her, his defenses momentarily lowered. Yes, he admitted, it would. The simple honesty of his answer hung between them, changing everything and nothing all at. I should go, he said, stepping. Just be careful, please. I will, she promised. You too. As his footsteps retreated down the hallway, Sarah closed her door, leaning against it. Outside her window, the stars continued their silent journey across the sky, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but for tonight, a single word echoed in her mind, filling empty spaces she'd thought permanently barren.